First thing I'm going to do is, like with any beginning of a new set, I'm going to make sure that I've got my landmarks aligned. So if I don't check that, you know, she initially got back into the right pose, I can't complain later on. This area here is getting kind of a halftone because there's that shift in form in the brow ridge. Still catching some light. It's probably the part of the light that's getting the least amount of direct light. Here, actually catching a little bit of shadow still, but it's just a more of a reflecting light, so I'm going to take that down. There's this area here that's cooler, but it's also slightly, or I should say very neutral. So I'm working up to adding the more prominent blue into this mixture. I don't want to go to it too soon. Otherwise I might end up making that reflected light too intense. Kind of going back in with that initial first block end color to clarify where some of the forms are changing. Working up to adding some blue. The thing is, if you go overboard with the blue, it'll look like she's bruised in the shadow rather than actual cool light. And one thing to remember is that I know I've said this a few times, but you're at a perspective that's far beneath the model. So I actually see a little bit of the bottom plane of that, of the jaw. So I want to avoid the habit of wanting to draw it from a point of view to where I'm at the same eye level as she is. Otherwise I'm going to end up really throwing off the overall drawing. I can see a little bit of the bottom plane right there. So it's almost like I'm looking at a box from that point of view that's slightly above it. So I see a little bit of the bottom of the theoretical box. If there's anything you take from this, you know, I really want to make sure that everybody realizes, and I'm sure you know this by now, but just to bring it up again, you know, when you're doing your self-portrait project at home, it's not something you're going to nail in 1 day or even 2 days. You've got to plan accordingly. It's just a time-consuming process. There's no way around that. And my advice is if you think that something's going to take you 3 hours to do it, budget 5 hours. You end up running into a problem that you didn't anticipate. This self-portrait project will take you more than 3 hours, though, just to let you know. Probably more than 5, too. I wouldn't want to disappoint everybody by giving them a project that's too easy. What's that? Oh, I didn't want you to feel ripped off. So I'm going to start hatching in a little bit of that blue in the shadow now. Might even move in just a second to some pastel pencils. If you don't have pastel pencils, you don't feel the need to go out and spend more money if you can't afford it. What you could do is take your pastel stick, have one end, keep it the way that you've been drawing with it, take the other end and sharpen it to a point, and you can kind of go back and forth. Just for the sake of speed, I always have a set of pastel pencils with me though. Speed being a relative term here. Yeah, it is. Yeah. You can see it right there. What's that?
Is it a violet?
A little bit it shifts towards that, but I'm thinking about it. I mean, it's very subtle that it shifts towards violet, but the one thing that I think you can look at from when I put it down heavily versus with light pressure, you can get a value shift just by the pressure you're putting on. And I'm being very careful to put very subtle pressure on it, otherwise I might go overboard with the transition I'm trying to make. And it does make a mix into a little bit of a violet because I have kind of a reddish, sort of neutral reddish base underneath it. But I'm letting some of that red show through, which is why that some areas are having that subtle violet tone in them. I'm not trying to cover everything I've put down. I'm trying to use one layer that I put down to be support to the next layer that's going to come on top of it. I think that's the way you should always be thinking, is that everything you do should be a support to the next thing you're going to do. And sort of subtly as I block this in, letting some of these more prominent lines that I put down in the underdrawing gradually blend into the mask that I'm adjusting. Maybe I'll make a quick reference to the warm light on the hair as well. The one thing not to do, especially when you have a model that has darker hair, the lighter areas, sometimes there's a tendency for a lot of people to do this. They see light hitting the darker hair, and the instinct is they go to a really light pastel or a really light pigment, and they throw it right into the hair, and it totally makes the hair look like it's like there's snow or something falling on it. So, the light area of her hair is obviously a little lighter than the shadow, but it's nowhere near the value of the light mask that's on the face. So I'm picking a warm neutral that's a little lighter than what I've done for the hair, but nowhere near the value I would need right now for the face. And I'm making my marks in the direction of the hair, not to reference every single strand. Just which direction is the hair moving. A little bit of it's catching some light here, but not very much. I might jump to that negative space again. Some areas that can come down in value, which will affect how the hair is looking. And then I might jump a little bit to what the bandana she has in her hair, and then I'm probably going to let it stay there for the time being. Maybe I'll do a little bit to the mouth as well, but I'm not going to take it too much further today. Sort of working back and forth from this black, which is essentially a neutral blue, to the more subtly more intense blue to make this transition. I can go back and reference that hair by coming back in that warm pigment I was using earlier. And when you get to areas like say where the hair and the negative and the background negative space are coming together, I can kind of go over the edge there a little bit and always bring it back up with that same warm pigment again. That way I won't end up having this issue where the negative space meets the hair and then creates this really hard edge, which kind of can flatten the form. So in certain areas, you know, you can kind of let some of the edges blend together by drawing over them subtly. Just make sure that in the end you go back and make sure there's clarity in terms of what's happening on that edge. Is it kind of a hard edge, an in-between edge, a really soft edge? So I can come back over and light pressure subtly indicate, okay, there's the hair there that's meeting. Bring up a few of the pencils. And I don't want to say there's a certain time of the drawing when you should bring in the pastel pencils. It really is variable depending on every pose. And like I said, if you don't want to buy pencils, just sharpen the end of one of the pastel sticks. But for areas like here, where I've got really noticeable changes in the form, I can come in and kind of like standard hatching and cross hatching, kind of sculpt in the direction of the form. Use a pencil to guard your hand if you have to. Just trying to polish, well, maybe polish isn't the right word, clarify this form. Gradually, some edges kind of start getting blended a little bit as needed. But that's kind of how I deal with subtle transition with edges. I draw over them subtly in stages rather than trying to blend them with my finger and kind of blurring out my whole image. Find the shape a little bit of the mouth. And I'm basically using a really kind of darker valued umberish kind of pastel pencil to clarify some of these darks. And for like right here, if you look close, you'll notice on this far side there's a little bit of the bottom lip that's catching some light just on this one spot. It's probably a little premature to put this in now, but just to kind of show you what I mean by building up to the lights. You can come in and just, with a couple of marks, make a reference to that light. It might be hard to see on that projection, but right here, just subtly putting it in much later because it's such a small shape. So those tiny shapes, they can come in later. Don't worry about them too soon. Keep your focus on the large masses. And work your way up to the lighter areas.
Are you back with the gray? Or
Yeah, a little bit. This will probably be easier to see on the video screen when I put it on the class notes thing.
The same gray started with before?
Yeah, but I'm putting it in very. I'm just barely skimming the surface. Because if I go with too much pressure, I'm going to overdo it. So if you have to err on the side of lighter pressured marks before heavy ones. And sometimes what I would do is I'll start out with a mark and I'll just be enough to scratch the surface with it, just barely, and then as I find I need to, I gradually add more pressure as it's needed, rather than just going in one punch and trying to throw it all in too heavily. I mean, with more drawing experience, you'll kind of get a better feel for, you know, how much pressure to put down and stuff. But I'd say at this stage, err on the side of being a little bit lighter in the pressure and just gradually add it more as you find that you have to. So, anyway, I think I'm going to leave it right about there, and I'm going to pick the rest of it up on Monday. And this is about as far, I mean, most of you might not get this far today, but this is the way to start out adding the color, and I would say it's the way to start out dealing with color when you get to your self-portrait project. I'm not even thinking about really what's going on in the light mass in terms of all of the variations. I'm prioritizing these variations in the shadows so I don't end up going overboard with too much light in the light mass. Are there any questions? Actually, I might make one quick reference to her bandana in her hair, and then I'll stop. I think maybe as a reference on why going to the light would be a bad thing right now, I'm going to probably intentionally right now put a really light value there. I'm going to take it off, but I'm going to put it up there so you can kind of see the relationship of what happens to the rest of the drawing when you put something too light in there too soon. Again, that's another advantage of pastel board. It's pretty easy to draw back over and take something off. So if I were to take this light pink pigment, which most people will say, that's flesh tone, right? No. Not unless everybody has the exact same flesh tone in the entire planet. And it's also really light. Look how light that looks now. And now look at her forehead. The lighter highlight is right here. So I go to the right, it gets darker. If I fill this whole forehead with this pigment, I've just flattened out the whole space. All right? So that's why I'm being very cautious about working up to my lights. I don't want to miscue anything. Take that back off. So, and some of you probably realize this by now, but the reason I'm not blending is that if I put this down and go, oh, but I want a soft transition, I just created a big cloudy mess on my drawing. All right, so that's why I'm emphasizing vary the pressure on the stick, not, you know, to get edges, not to just blend them with your finger. Plus, you don't want to dig the pastel pigment into your skin and bloodstream and all that kind of stuff. So, anyway, any questions so far?